Okay, welcome back everyone to our second session in Journey of the Soul. Last week, of course, we explored the whole relationship between body and soul and the eternality of the soul, how we can work towards changing our attitude towards death. And tonight we move on to a lesson which has really four parts. The first is going to discuss the spiritual significance of the moment of a person's passing. What actually happens at that moment, and how does Judaism understand this very fateful moment of transition? So that's the first thing that we're going to explore. And then we're going to talk about the process of the soul's departure from the body. In the third and the fourth parts, we're going to examine the Jewish traditions that surround the care of the body of the person who's passed away and its burial. And then towards the end, we're going to talk about visiting graves. Each of these four topics all have an overarching theme, and that is, and the thing which we really want to talk about tonight, is not so much just the information about what happens, which is all very interesting, but our continuing connection that we're going to maintain with the person who's passed away, and by the way, vice versa, the way in which they're going to remain in touch and connected with us. So here's our story for tonight. The moment of passing, the process of the soul's departure, the care of the body and its burial, interment, and the question of visiting graves. Okay? We're going to begin with the significance of the moment of a person's passing. Obviously, it's the beginning, a new beginning. It's the onset of a new phase in the journey's, the soul's journey, because now the soul is no longer tethered to the world of the material. It's now free. It's going to be able to connect with the spiritual, with the heavenly realms, which we're going to explore in more detail next week. But what actually happens when the soul leaves the body? So we're going to begin with an excerpt of a letter that was written by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi in 1788. And it's a letter that he sent to the grief-stricken Hasidim of the recently deceased Hasidic master, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Horodok. He was the leader of the Hasidic movement at that fledgling time, and he had made Aliyah. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman was still back in Russia, and he sends a letter to him and attempts to console the bereaved Hasidim, both those in Israel and those in Russia, explaining to them that the connection to their leader, to their Rebbe, to their spiritual leader, doesn't necessarily have to suffer as a result of his physical absence. On the contrary, he wants to explain that, ironically, the Hasidim have an even deeper relationship with the Rebbe after he's passed away. Now, before we can actually study this letter, we need to explain some of the terms that he uses there, and these are really, really important. So, although we talk about an neshama, a soul, in reality, it actually has 5 component parts. Each one has its own special name, but for the purposes of tonight, and for the purposes of what we need to know, and for the purposes of the text that we're going to look at, we only need to be familiar with 2 of the soul's component parts, the 2 lowest levels of the soul. And they are called Nephesh and Ruach. Now, generally speaking, Nephesh is the soul component that, even though it's spiritual, is there to provide the physical life and the powers of bodily function. It's what makes us move. It's what energizes us, what gives us, what vivifies the actual physical body. Once a person passes away, the part of the soul that serves as this biological function, the nephesh, actually remains in the grave with the body. And the ruach, the person's emotions and their feelings, which we'll talk about a bit more in a moment, that rises up and it goes to a higher realm, which for the moment we will call Gan Eden. So we can turn to our first reading tonight. It's on page 42. It's figure 2.1. And here you see the two lowest levels of the soul. That's the Nephesh, nicely shown with some toothpaste, and the Ruach, the emotion, nicely depicted. So let's take a look at on page 43. Let's start to read the letter. It's text number 1a. And once again, perhaps somebody who hasn't read yet can have a chance just to pipe up and go for it.
I will, if you like. Sorry.
Okay?
Yeah. As is known, the life of the Tzaddik, righteous person, is not a physical but spiritual. It consists of faith, reverence, and love for God. During the Tzaddik's lifetime on earth, these three attributes that belong to the soul dimension of Ruach are constrained within their container and garb, namely the Nephesh that is bound to the corporeal body. This imposes the restraints of physical space upon these attributes. As a result, all the Tzaddik's disciples receive but a glow of these Ruach attributes, a mere ray that is emitted beyond the container by means, by means of the Tzaddik's holy words and thoughts. The inability to receive directly from Ruach is a revelatory handicap, and therefore our sages stated that it takes 40 years for students to fully plumb the depths of their master's teachings. Talmud Avodah Zarah. By contrast, after the Tzaddik's passing, the Nephesh separates from the Ruach and remains in the grave, while the Ruach and its three attributes rise to Gan Eden. Consequently, whoever is close to the Tzaddik can receive directly from his Ruach in Gan Eden, because the Ruach is no longer restrained in a container or confined to a physical space. There is now a straightforward path for the Tzaddik's disciples to connect with the essence of their master's Ruach, the faith, awe, and love which the Tzaddik served God, and not merely these attributes outer glow that escaped beyond their container. The disciples connect and receive commensurate to the degree of their loving connection and closeness to the Tzaddik during his lifetime and after his death. For the transmission of all things spiritual is always by means of great love.
Thank you. Well, of course, he's speaking to learned Hasidim, and they'll know what he's talking about, and we don't have a clue what he's talking about. But he's actually saying something very, very important. And we're going to unpack this now because it has huge, huge implications for us in relation to those who've passed away. So, just to recapitulate over here, the primary expression of a righteous person, a saintly, a godly person's life, are his emunah, his faith, his ahava, his love of God, his yirah, his fear of God, reverence for God, etc. These are rooted and driven by the ruach element of a person's soul. That's where it resides. And as long as the person is alive, this capacity to share and to give to others and to express to others and for others to be able to take from it is limited, because you can't get out from inside of you what is there in a physical sense. There's always going to be a limitation on what you can give and what others can take from you. So the people with whom one comes into contact can never in a person's lifetime ever relate to the essence of the person's qualities and attributes. But when at death the Nephesh and the Ruach separate, all of those components which were locked up, caught up in the Ruach part of the Neshama, are set free, and it's unleashed, and its very essence is now accessible to everyone who wants to connect with it. Because a spiritual entity doesn't occupy a physical location, it's there everywhere, it can be accessed anywhere. Now we are talking here about a tzaddik. In this particular instance, we're going to be talking about us in just a moment. But let's follow on. And therefore, when the physical avenues of connection are shut off, the possibility of spiritual connection not only remains, but paradoxically is stronger and deeper than before. And the separation of the Ruach from the Nephesh is significant on its own, not only in regard to our relationship with the person who's died, but the next text which we're going to look at is going to tell us how the soul of the person who's passed away benefits from the separation from the body. And now we're going to look on page 45 at text number 1b. A spirit unshackled.
I'll read this. It's also a matter of common sense that whatever the direct cause of the separation of the soul from the body, whether a fatal accident or a fatal illness, etc., it could affect only any of the vital organs of the physical body, but could in no way affect the spiritual soul. A further point, which is also understandable, is that during the soul's lifetime on earth, in partnership with the body, the soul is necessarily handicapped, in certain respects, by the requirements of the body, such as eating and drinking, etc. Even a tzaddik, whose entire life is consecrated to Hashem, cannot escape the restraints of life in a material and physical environment. Consequently, when the time comes for the soul to return home, it is essentially a release for it as it makes its ascent to a higher world, no longer restrained by physical body and physical environment. Henceforth, the soul is free to enjoy the spiritual bliss, being near to Hashem in the fullest measure.
Thank you. And we're going to take a look at this. That's what we've said as part of the life of a tzaddik. It's the emunah and the reverence, the love. It's limited to expression through the Nephesh during the lifetime. It's at passing, it moves on. The Ruach is unleashed, and that brings us to a little video.
How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear? That's what psychologists call inattentional blindness. And no, it is not a condition to be concerned about. In fact, life would be impossible without it. Let me explain. As powerful as the human brain may be, it is easily overwhelmed by the sheer onslaught of observation, calculation, sight, sound, and signals that envelop our every waking hour. The brain cannot permit itself to register and record each image and movement, every message and stimulation. Instead, our brains and nervous systems aggressively filter and limit our intake to manageable levels. The result? We notice a fraction and ignore the fullness, and remember far less. Often, we purposely engage in what cognitive neuroscientists call selective attention, like focusing on a dinner partner in a crowded restaurant, while tuning out all other conversations in the room. Now imagine that you had the ability to absorb everything around you. to absorb, comprehend, and recall all the details, and fetch every memory at will, without being overwhelmed. That is the incredible experience of the human soul, once it detaches from the body at the close of a lifetime. Unshackled from the frailties of a nervous system, unrestricted by networks of neurons, it is unbelievably free and powerfully present. It is free to absorb truths that mortal minds cannot contain, present to delight in the divine radiance that courses through the cosmos, to bask in divine understanding that supersedes human senses, but is savored by the newly liberated soul.
And that's all to be able to show that in our lifetime we're limited, and in death we can touch the essential soul. So that's the reality, you see. Our feelings are limited by our physical bodies, even vis-a-vis ourselves. The physical heart is incapable of processing and experiencing emotions at their essential level. What we really experience is something which is a watered down version of this intense soul feeling. But once the Ruach departs from the body, it's revealed. It's free to experience itself in a much deeper way than before. I suppose if you wanted to put it in very kind of basic terms, the emotions we experience when we're still alive are like watching a high-definition video on a device that isn't suited to play high-definition footage. And it's this heightened level of self that others can tap into after a person's parting. And that's why it explains on a mystical level that the moment of a person's parting is actually highly, highly significant. Because at that moment, all of the person's spiritual energy held, captured in their Ruach is unleashed, no longer tethered to its material limiting container. And it's revealed to itself, but just as significantly, it's revealed to those who loved the person. So when Rabbi Shneur Zalman, although he's specifically discussing a tzaddik, but the idea actually applies to all of us. Because, yes, of course, there are some holy people, the righteous, whose lives are full of faith and reverence and love for God. Perhaps that's not us. But we do know that when you relate to another human being, when you're connected to somebody who you love, you can't quite put your finger on what is it that you're actually loving. What are the qualities of this person? Who is this person? Where is this person? And the answer is that all of their emotions, all of the love that they feel for you, all of their whole sense of being, their integrity, all the things which qualify their life, all the things which make up who this person is, all of that is held in this part of the soul called the Ruach. And it's limited. You can never get to its essence when a person is alive. All you have is an external expression of it to you. Sometimes beautiful and meaningful, sometimes clumsy and inadequate. You know that there's something very deep there, but communicating with it, touching it, knowing it, is such a difficult human experience. And that's the Ruach part of that person's soul. That's who the person really is. That's where all of their emotions, their ideals, their aspirations, everything which makes up the package of this human being, that's where they're contained. And when a person who you loved passes on, those ideals and those feelings and those principles don't all of them don't vanish. They become intensified and they become accessible, reachable by the person who seeks to connect with that person through love. And the more we love, the more we are connected. And when we connect, we're actually connecting to the deepest part of that human being. By the way, some people suggest that this is one of the reasons why we tend to have a greater appreciation for people and their noble qualities after they've died. Isn't it funny how you start to talk about who the person was, when you hear these eulogies, I always find myself kind of laughing because, sometimes you go along and it turns out that everybody, every human being was the biggest tzaddik in the world and the most righteous person and everything else, and the guy next to you is sniggering and says, oh no, it wasn't, it was, well, that lovely old story about the rabbi who had one enemy in the community. Unfortunately, he passed away and he had to eulogize him and he didn't want to tell a lie and he didn't know what to say. And he stood there in complete silence for an entire minute. And then he said, and his brother was no better. Well, I suppose one of the reasons why we appreciate people sometimes more after they've died is because absence and the yearning make the heart grow fonder, or perhaps there's less exposure to their irritating side, the things which used to nudge the life out of you. All of that is gone, so you see them in a different light. But the fact of the matter is that their positive qualities are revealed and intensified at the moment of passing. So the problem, of course, is that we are not equipped to celebrate this spiritual milestone at that moment in time. We're not jumping up and down and saying, yay, the person has died, hooray, now I can reach them, their Ruach has separated, I can touch their Ruach. On the contrary, you're devastated, you're crying, it's emotional and everything else. And that's one of the great paradoxes of this moment. That's why we need to come back at the end of a year in the yard site and then be able to see it in a different light. And we'll talk about that in one of our coming lessons. But the difficult moment of passing, when it seems as if the person who has died has been disconnected from his or her loved ones, is actually the moment that has the potential to intensify all of his or her existing relationships. And that's what Rabbi Shneur Zalman has explained in this piece that we've read. And to be in touch with the person who's died, you have to love them. And you have to tap into those qualities that they had in our own lives, and that creates that special connection. A true loving relationship demands that we relate to and meet another person on their terms. And this is really difficult because we don't know how to move from the physical to the spiritual in terms of relationships. We're so tactile, we're so used to a hug, we're so used to an embrace, we're so used to the look of an eye, a share, a smile, that when that's not there, it's so hard for us to be able to develop a different kind of relationship. But a parent relates to a toddler by shaking a rattle. That doesn't work for a 5-year-old. For a 5-year-old, you've got to read The Cat in the Hat. At 11, you play a game of Monopoly with a child. At 18, you have a different kind of relationship. Relationships, even with our parents, constantly evolve as they get older and as we get older. And when a person passes away, many, or possibly even most of the things that interested them before no longer hold any meaning for them now. So if we want to continue the relationship, we're challenged to meet the person we loved in their current state. And that means becoming more spiritually attuned. And when we do so, we connect in a very profoundly meaningful way. Psychologists, of course, have a name for this. They refer to the continuing relationship with people who you've loved as continuing bonds. Well, look, nobody said that relationships are easy, as everyone knows. So, let's take it one slide further and simply encapsulate everything I've said by saying that our relationship with the person who's passed away now has to become spiritual. This is a very hard thing to do. And we're going to do a little experiment tonight, something which we didn't do last week. We're going to watch a video meditation. And this is designed to help us to try and grasp this idea that we are in contact and feel close to a person who's passed away. So let's try this.
Welcome to our meditation reflection for Lesson 2 of Journey of the Soul. We're going to try to visualize and relate to the idea of the continuing connection between those who are still inhabiting this world and their loved ones who have moved on. How can we visualize this connection? So I want to share with you a metaphor that was given by the Lubavitcher Rebbe to a grieving family when they lost their dear mother. The Rebbe told the family, you should know that your loved one, when they pass away, hasn't gone to some faraway place. Really, what is the situation? It's as if the whole family is together on the first floor of the house, and this loved one is in the same house with you on the second floor. So we're going to try to visualize. Again, if it helps you to close your eyes, you can close your eyes. If you want to leave your eyes open, leave your eyes open. But start to visualize in your mind's eye a loved one who's passed on. Try to imagine what it was like when you would gather and that person was physically with you. Try to remember the sights, the sounds, the whole setting. And now, imagine that exact same gathering, same setting, and that loved one who's passed on is still there with one difference. They're on the second floor. Take a moment to imagine the feeling. It's hard to describe it, but if we envision it, we may be able to feel it. What does it feel like? The knowledge that this loved one, you may not be able to see them, but they're right there, very, very close by, in the same house, where the family is together, everyone is there, and the only difference is they're upstairs, they're on the second floor. Let's try to envision, let's try to visualize a loved one. Try to remember what it was like when they were on the first floor. And now think about the exact same setting. What does it feel like? What does it feel like knowing that they're on the second floor? They're with us. They're with us. They're in the same house. They're only just a few feet away. Not far, far, far away. Very close by, on the second floor. take a half a minute to visualize and try to connect to this feeling of the loved one on the second floor.
Okay. Well, it's not to say, by the way, that the process of dying is easy, particularly, as you know, in the last phases. And understandably, the moments before passing can be very difficult emotionally on the dying person. And tonight we are talking really about the person who's passed away as opposed to us and our feelings, which we'll be talking about next week. And therefore, end-of-life medical care includes helping a dying person manage his or her distress, and there's a lot of medical literature dedicated to the importance of treating emotional pain and suffering at the end of life. And we're going to outline a few basic points of how we can help a person to die more easily. And before we go into this session, I wanted to say that one of the most painful things about this whole COVID period, of course, apart from the terrible, terrible loss of loved ones who died from COVID, has been the fact that they've had to die alone, that you couldn't be with them. I know there are some people who are with us here tonight who suffered that sort of bereavement, and a spouse was all alone, couldn't visit them in hospital, family members couldn't be there. Really, really hard. And if I think back to my mother and my sisters, our mum, whose first Yortzeit is tomorrow night, who died just before COVID, so we're able to be round her bedside, all of us together, just as she wanted, holding her hand and giving her comfort and helping her on her journey. And the thought that there'd be some who couldn't do this is absolutely heartbreaking. And so I just want to acknowledge that before we look at some of these points here. But these are the ways in which one would try to ease a person's journey. The first, of course, is having emotionally honest communication with the person who's dying, and particularly with family members. It's about speaking to the person, even if they're unable to respond, they hear, reminiscing about good memories and ways that the person has positively impacted on your life, can be very meaningful and soothing. Tell the person they lived their life well. That's what we told my mum. Physical contact with the person who's dying can be hugely important. It may not always be necessary to fill the time talking or with activity. Just the quiet presence of a family member or friend can be a simple and a profound gift to someone in their last moments. Many years ago, a young woman suffering from leukemia, unfortunately, Sue Harris, her name was unable to get a suitable bone marrow donor. And I remember visiting in hospital in her last moments and having all of her friends all around the bed with her. And it was just terribly, terribly moving. And there was no speaking. They were just all there. And she felt them, and you just knew that there was a bond that was making it easier for her. She knew that she was dying. And she was comforted by the presence of all of her friends. And setting a comforting atmosphere can be helpful. Sometimes music is important. When my father-in-law of blessed memory was dying, our boys, Lindy, my children, all gathered around his bed and they sang to him. They sang all the beautiful tunes, and we could see that it was making a difference to him. It was helping him. So this is about end-of-life comfort, and that's really what's shown in this next little slide here. Just some of the tips, most of which I presume you probably know. But based on what we just learned, you might imagine that the soul would be happy to separate from the body, because it's going to be free, completely untethered. It's going to be a spiritual being. It's going to be able to experience itself to the fullest extent possible. It's going to enter a new dimension where the hardships, the temptations, the failures that typify this world will be just a distant memory. So yes, the soul must be delighted to separate from the body. But the Kabbalah, the Zohar, tells us otherwise. It's a short text. It's on page 47. It's text number 2. And because it's so short, I'll read it to you. Nothing is as hard for the soul as its separation from the body. Now, why would that be? First of all, because death is the ultimate transition, and all transitions in life are really difficult. Even if they're necessary and positive ones, we find them difficult. That's true when we go into a new situation, leaving whatever we have been doing to which we've been accustomed. A child is accustomed to his home comforts and his routine and people. Remember what it was like bringing your child to school if you had that opportunity, the way they screamed and shouted and wouldn't let you go, and you had to sit in the classroom with them for a while. And the same could be said about a career change or other changes in family environment. All of these are really difficult, very difficult. We're creatures of habit. We create our own habitat and we fill it with our habits, both good and bad. It's very frightening to go from this one situation, even if we know that it's imperfect, into one which we simply don't know about. So that's the first reason. And the second reason is because, as we learned last week, it's only here when the soul is actually in the physical body that the soul can have an impact and do all of its good things. But thirdly, and possibly most importantly, the soul enters this world on a mission. And to fulfill that mission, body and soul have to dance together. There's no other way. They jive all the way through life. They're connected. And that means that the soul is with the body as it experiences all of its earthly pursuits. And just as the soul influences the body and the world and the body influence the soul. To a degree, souls become attached to their earthly surroundings. And therefore the process of separation, of divestment, is very, very intense. While they are together in this world, the fusion of the soul and the body is absolutely seamless. And it's so seamless that when the soul has to pull away from the body, it's terribly painful, not only for the loved ones, but for the soul itself. The pain that the soul experiences indicates just the extent to which it's attached to and appreciative of the body, despite all the obstacles that bodies present. It's like a couple who maybe they argue a lot, but at the end of the day, they're attached to the hip. Hard to let go. So we have figure 2.2 on page 48, and we have some slides to indicate this as well. And that's why it's difficult. Well, in a sense, I suppose this is counterintuitive because, you'd think the soul would fly to the celestial heights without thinking much about the body's arms and legs or face, especially now it can't move. But the body was so precious, that's so integral to its mission, that it has difficulty letting go. Actually, there are 4 general stages to the soul's departure. This ripping apart of soul from the body happens in a transitionary way, and we're going to look now at those stages. So the first stage is the one that we've just spoken about. That is when the Ruach begins to separate from the Nephesh. But there are 3 more stages. One after 3 days and the next after 7 days. Let's take a look at text number 4a on page 50. Actually, we need text number 3 on page 49 first. For 3 days, the soul hovers above the body, thinking that it can return to it. Hope springs eternal in the human breast. The soul's not quite sure whether it's ready to leave yet. So it keeps coming back and back, just like the dove in Noah's Ark. It's not ready to leave yet. So for 3 days, the soul hovers above the body, thinking that perhaps it can return to it. This is taken from the Jerusalem Talmud. After 3 days, when it sees that the body's face has changed, it leaves the body and departs. And then in text 4a, taken from the Zohar, that's on page 50. For 7 days, the soul goes from the house where it lived to the grave, and from the grave back to the house, and it mourns its body. And after 7 days, the body is subjected to its fate, and it's time for the soul to leave, and so it ascends to its place. And then, on page 50 still, in text 4b, for 30 days, the soul and the body are judged as one, and therefore the soul is still located down here on earth. And after that, the soul ascends while the body erodes in the earth. And then, on page 51, text 4c. First 12 months. For 12 months, the body still exists, and the soul ascends and descends for the whole of that year, good people, the whole of that year. After 12 months, the body becomes null, and the soul rises and no longer returns. Now, here we are. Let's take a look at this. Here are the stages of the soul's departure from the body. 3 days, the soul hovers over the body. 7 days, it vacillates between the grave and its home. For 30 days, it's still located on earth. And for 12 months, it vacillates between heaven and earth. Now, if you are paying very close attention, you will begin to see a significance in, you might not get the 3, but you'll definitely get the 7, the 30, and the 12. But here we're talking about the soul, not about what we do yet. Okay? This is what happens to the soul during this time. So here we have 4 sources, each saying the soul leaves at a different time, 3, 7, 30, 12. And there's also the text which we studied at the beginning of today's lesson, where the Ruach separates from the Nephesh at the moment of death. And so clearly there's a process here in which the soul's connection to the body is gradually weakened as the body gradually decomposes, starting immediately and concluding over 12 months. Now again, we need to emphasize that everything that we're learning in our lesson today connects with a central idea of the soul's continuing connection to this world and its loved ones, and the connection of the loved ones to the soul. And therefore this continuing posthumous connection is also reflected in the process of the soul's departure. How so? Because, as you've probably already noticed, fascinatingly, the 4 stages of departure correspond to the staged periods of mourning that are prescribed by Jewish law. And this following text from Maimonides outlines these stages. It's on page 52. It's text number 5. If somebody would please read it.
Mourners observe 3 days of weeping, 7 days of eulogies, and for 30 days restrictions on haircuts and wearing freshly ironed clothing, marrying, joining a celebration of friends, and travelling on business.
That's the Shiva period, isn't it? So, according to Jewish tradition, mourning gradually decreases in intensity. We cry for 3 days and eulogize. I mean to say, we talk about the qualities and the goodness of the deceased for 7 days. And although we re-emerge after 7 days of the Shiva and we reassume our normal place in the society, we still practice some forms of mourning for a month. And although it's not mentioned in this text, some lesser mourning practices continue for 12 months, particularly for the loss of a parent. And on page 53 in text number 6, there is another text. And we'll be discussing, by the way, the stages and mourning practices at some length in next week's lesson. Would somebody read text number 6, please?
If you encounter an acquaintance within 30 days of that person having lost a next of kin, offer words of consolation and avoid the customary pleasantries. If 30 days have elapsed since the relative's passing, greet your acquaintance in the usual manner and offer indirect words of consolation.
Well, those dulcet tones must be Les Berger from Israel. How nice to have you with us, Les. Okay, so our degree of mourning mirrors the degree of struggle that the soul experiences in the process of ascending to the realms from which it originally came. It's a mirror. The soul is struggling, and we are reflecting the struggle. So when we mourn, we're actually mourning not only, this is really important, we're actually mourning not only for the deceased, but we're also mourning with the deceased. We're accompanying the soul on its journey. We're participating in its struggle. We're sharing its pain. We're empathizing with it. And the connection continues. Let's take a look at the next slides. And there you have it. Mourn for the soul and mourn with the soul. Revelatory. And based on this idea, therefore, we can understand a very curious halakha in the context of a Talmudic episode. That's on page 54. It's text number 7. It needs a reader, please.
If a person dies and leaves no next of kin to be comforted, 10 people should go and sit in the deceased's home. A man died in Rabbi Yehuda's neighbourhood. As there were no mourners to be comforted, Rabbi Yehuda assembled 10 people every day, and they sat in the deceased's home. After 7 days, a dead man appeared to Rabbi Yehuda in a dream and said, "May your mind be at rest, for you have set my mind at rest.
So you see, what is important about this piece of text is that if we understand the function of Shiva as merely the expression of a mourner's grief and pain, this entire story is puzzling. Because if there's no one to feel pain because the mourner, the person who died, had no mourners, why do we need to have a Shiva home, for goodness sake? And why should the soul be touched by this gesture? And the proof of this piece over here is to tell us that the Shiva is also about sharing the soul's pain. And therefore it's pertinent and important regardless of whether they are mourners or not. Because during the Shiva, the mourners are sharing the soul's pain. The comforters come to comfort the mourners and the soul of the deceased as well. All right, let's move on a bit now. The idea that the person who passed away remains very much spiritually alive and connected to those who loved and cherished them during their lifetimes is very, very much demonstrated and emphasized by our whole funeral tradition. I think we're going to learn something which most people will not know for all the funerals that you've attended in your life. And by the way, this is whole chunks of this piece over here in the teacher's manual applies specifically to America, and I have excluded them, but I'll tell you where the differences are. Because Americans have developed very different funeral customs to the ones which we have retained here in England. I'll explain in a moment. So the special mitzvah at a funeral for both mourners and attendees is actually called Halvayat Hamet, which translates as escorting the dead. And that's, by the way, why a funeral is colloquially called a levaya. Levaya in the Ashkenazi pronunciation. A levaya means to accompany. So the mitzvah is not to attend a ceremony, but to actually accompany and escort the deceased to burial. Now, people who go to funerals over here in this country do that. Everybody stands in the hall, and we have a bit of a service, and everybody shuffles down to the grave, and they are performing the mitzvah of Halvayat Hamet. You might have, if you were very observant, I don't mean observant in religious terms, but just watching, see what happens, you might have noticed a rabbi coming back from attending to another funeral, walking in the opposite direction of the cortege, and as the cortege passes, he will stop, turn round and walk a few steps together with everyone else to fulfill the mitzvah of accompanying the dead. That's levaya. The reason why it's different in America is because it seems in America, and those of you who are from America who can confirm this, that everybody goes to the hall and not everybody attends a ceremony, and then they all go home, and then a couple of people go down with the body to the grave, but not everybody is around the graveside. So actually, they've missed out the whole point. Yeah? The ceremony is nothing. It's the accompanying the body. Here
That hasn't occurred on the two funerals that I've been to in America.
Perhaps my sister Lydia might comment. You need to unmute, Lyd. Not hearing you. Okay. At any rate, that's what needs to be done. Here in England, by the way, when you have a very Haredi funeral, very often people don't go to the grounds at all. And what happens is that the body is brought to the home where the person died. The casket is in the home. And everybody gathers outside the home. The hearse draws up outside the home. They say some prayers. And the hearse goes slowly down the street, and everybody walks behind it to the end of the block or whatever, and then the hearse goes off to the funeral, and those who are going to the grounds, because the grounds in some instances are very far away, so not everybody can get there, and that's the way in which they raise it. But at any rate, the point over here is that the whole idea is not just to respect the mourners, or even to respect the deceased person, but to actually accompany the deceased on their final journey. And that's called Halvayat Hamet. And here it is in our next slide. And this leads us to the next topic of discussion, and that is burial and care for the body at the time that precedes the funeral. Because after all, the body is now lifeless, except for the fact that, of course, the Nephesh is still connected to it. So how does this lifeless body retain any importance? Here's a very interesting text on page 55, text number 8a. It's a very stunning comparison. It's very short. Shall I read it? Yeah. One who is present at the time of a person's passing is required to tear their clothing, and this is because a person's passing is likened to the burning of a Torah scroll. If you see a Torah scroll being burned or destroyed, you're supposed to tear kriya, to tear your clothes. We don't practice that these days. But the Talmud says that when you witness a person dying, you have to have the same reaction as you would have had to the destruction of a Sefer Torah. And the question is, what is the comparison between a person and a Sefer Torah? Other than the fact, of course, that they're both holy. So Nachmanides, the Ramban, gives us an understanding of why a human being is compared to a Torah scroll, and this is on page 56, text 8b. Again, it's a very short little piece, so I shall read it. Nachmanides points to the sacred names of God that are inked on a Torah scroll parchment as an analogy for the sacred soul that is installed within the corporeal body. So here's the comparison. The body of a Jew is there compared to the parchment of a Sefer Torah. The soul is likened to God's holy names that are inscribed on the parchment. The parchment of a Sefer Torah starts off as just a simple, mundane piece of animal hide. It could just as well have ended up as a belt or a pair of shoes. But when it's been properly prepared, it attains great holiness and becomes a revered object. The human body, by comparison, by analogy, starts off as just a bunch of flesh and bones. But then the soul, the spark of God, is infused into it, and just like the Sefer Torah, the parchment becomes holy, so too the body becomes holy. And this teaches us, therefore, the lesson of how we are to handle a dead body. This is text number 9 on page 57. A reader, please.
All who tend to a corpse must be aware that they are handling a holy entity. The human body is more than simply a sheath to a sacred entity, a tool that serves a supernal soul. Rather, it has itself become sanctified with an independent holiness, similar to a Torah scroll.
And here is the slides that indicate this. And there you have it. And therefore, the underlying principle that guides the care for a corpse is the incredible respect and dignity and sensitivity with which all the preparations are done. I once had the opportunity to watch a Chevra Kadisha at work. Generally speaking, unless you've been trained, even if you are a qualified rabbi, whatever, you're not permitted to be present when they are cleansing the body and preparing it for burial. Chevra Kadisha means a holy society. In this country, as in many others, it's done by volunteers, certainly for all the women in this country, although for the men sometimes it's done by the people who work at the burial society. But on this occasion, I watched a group of men, and I thought to myself, I am watching angels at work. It was just unbelievably moving. The dignity, the sense of holiness that you felt, the respect that was being accorded to this person lying on a slab was absolutely unbelievable. It's never treated as a lifeless, feelingless object. There's no casual conversation that's allowed in the presence of the person. At all times, they are covered, even when they're being cleansed. Private areas are only uncovered during the moments when they're actually being washed. Of course, men tend to male deceased, women wash and dress the female dead. Never is the body placed face down, because that's also considered to be disrespectful. And as you know, there has been an ancient custom which we are not any longer able to properly perform, and that is to keep company with the body, to be a shomer, wachting, as it is known, which is a Yiddish word. But there was a time when a body would remain, somebody would be present with the body from the moment that it passed away until the moment of burial. Now, there are two reasons for that, just to put it into context. One was because before the age of refrigeration, one had to protect the body from other kinds of things which could happen if it were left alone. And the second was respect for the body. One of the reasons why we no longer have wachting today is, apart from the fact that we just don't have people who are able to be night and day present. There used to be a lovely old man who you could call at any time to be a wachter, and he would get up in the middle of the night, schlep from Stamford Hill, and go and sit with the body for days on end. The man was a tzaddik, and he passed away and nobody else took his place. Because we have refrigeration now, and therefore the second of the two reasons no longer applies, we don't have wachting any longer, and today it's more or less accepted in many circles that when a person's passed away, the Chevra Kadisha come and take them to a mortuary, and they are looked after in the mortuary. But the proper way to do it is to have an honor guard. And sadly, it's not something which is always available. On page 58...
Just to say, Shlomo, I don't
Yes.
like to interrupt you, because
Please,
Marilyn.
Marilyn.
But talking about wachting, when my dear girlfriend died 2 years ago, we all us women, all the friends of hers, we took it in turns every hour to sit with her in Bushy. She was laid in a room in Bushy, and we sat with her throughout the night on a rota. So if you've got the people,
Yes.
apparently it is still done.
Absolutely. And I can tell you that Rabbi Sachs, Oliver Sholem, was wachted from the time that he passed away until the time of his burial. And interestingly enough, one of the wachters was Rabbi Eli, who was called in the middle of the night and got up to go and sit with him. And he sat together with Michael Leitner, and the two of them reminisced that years ago, the two of them were called in the middle of the night to wacht for Rabbi Sachs's mother when she passed away. And there they were, sitting together with her son. Very extraordinary. Page 58, text number 10. The Solemn Honor Guard. Well, let's read it. Please. Marilyn, why don't you read it, since you've raised this question, this issue?
Spoken. Okay. We are required to maintain constant watch over a corpse, even during the daytime, and even if there is no cause to suspect that something can happen to the body. Those who maintain watch are actively performing a mitzvah, to the extent that they are meanwhile absolved from many other mitzvot, such as reading the Shema and reciting the prayers at the appropriate times. We maintain a watch over the dead out of respect, for if we were to leave the body alone, it would appear as if we have abandoned it like a utensil that we no longer require.
Oh, isn't that powerful? And what a shame that we can't do that all the time. Well, here you are. Here are the slides. And that's how we look after our dead. By the way, as you probably know, every part of the body, including skin, bone fragments, tissue, fluid, must be respectfully buried. Because if you consider the body to be inherently holy, the body in its entirety must be buried. And that is why you might have seen, after those terrible terrorist attacks in Israel, you would have seen images on TV of Orthodox Jews, an organization known as Zaka, deployed to collect blood, skin, scrape it off the road, bone fragments strewn all over the whole area, so they can all be buried. And this, of course, is one of the issues relating to autopsies, but autopsies are permitted, just to make that clear, when it's necessary. And by the way, if you're going to be very strict, very often there's blood on sheets, for instance, of a deceased that was transferred from a hospital or from a long-term care facility. The disconnecting of lines and pipes from the body, so there's no skin or tissue or fluids, no part of the body, however small, is lost. That's the extent to which we respect the holiness of the body that contained the soul. And why is every part of the body so important? Because of text number 11 on page 60. There is no differentiation in reverential treatment between a complete Torah scroll and a single letter that has become detached from a Torah scroll. And similarly, it is forbidden to handle with disrespect even a single bone that has become detached from a sacred body that was created in God's image. And that leads us to a very important Jewish tradition, which is called burial. The mitzvah, by the way, to bury is actually found in the Torah. It's very short. It's text number 12 on page 61. It's taken from the book of Deuteronomy. You shall surely bury him on the same day as his death, which is why we hasten to bury on the same day as death. In Israel, of course, you never leave a body overnight. And that is why in Israel they will bury night, day and night, even on the Mount of Olives. They go up by torchlight and they bury at night because of this Torah injunction and the holiness of the land of Israel. Here, of course, it's not always possible, so sometimes you have to wait a day or two. And King Solomon, in text number 62, is text number 13 on page 62, puts it as follows. People proceed to their eternal abodes. This is from Ecclesiastes. People proceed to their eternal abodes, and the mourners go about the streets. The dust returns to the earth as it was, while the spirit returns to God who bestowed it. Body comes from the earth. It's entrusted as a deposit, and the deposit has to be returned from where it came. The point over here is that a human being is just a custodian of his body. The day eventually arrives when the custodian asks for the return of the deposit. So God takes the soul from man. Our task is to return the body. You can't literally hand a body over to God, but you can return it to the place from which God fashioned it. And that's what we read in the Bible, that God formed Adam from the dust of the ground and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And when God reclaims the breath of life, we ought to return the body to the ground, to the place from which God fashioned the first human being. Text number 14 on page 63. Why doesn't somebody read it? It's short. This is taken from Reb Chaim Vital. This is Kabbalistic.
For you are dust, return to dust. Genesis 3:19. The body comes from the earth and is entrusted as a deposit to the individual's care. Upon death, the deposit must be returned to the earth from where it came and buried there.
And by the way, the Torah recounts for us numerous episodes of burial. Abraham went to great lengths, as you know, to find a suitable plot to bury his wife Sarah. He buried her, of course, in Hebron, in the cave of Machpelah. Isaac and Ishmael buried their father Abraham. Jacob requested that he should not be buried in Egypt, but his body should be taken to the land of his forefathers, and his wish was fulfilled. Joseph's last request before he died was that his body should be returned and buried in the land of Israel. It took 140 years before that happened, but eventually when the Jews left Egypt, Moses, as his last act in Egypt, went and hunted out the body, the coffin, and they took Joseph's coffin and they schlepped it with it to the land of it, traveled through the desert for 40 years, and Joseph was eventually buried in Shechem. And God, of course, famously buries Moses in the valley opposite Beit Peor. So Jewish burial is known as Kever Yisrael. It was always considered the highest priority. And as you know, because of its great importance, the Israeli army is known to take huge risks going behind enemy lines to bring back bodies of their fallen comrades. Not so much in this country, but certainly in America, the tradition of burial is seriously being threatened by the popularity of cremation. It's clear that the number of Jewish cremations have grown over the recent years. As you know, those who are other than the Orthodox branch of Judaism will fancy cremation very often. Sometimes ecology is a factor. Lots of people believe that cremation is permissible, but from a Jewish point of view, it's clear that cremation destroys the body. It makes it impossible to fulfill the biblical injunction to bury the dead. And the burial really serves as an affirmation of two fundamental Jewish beliefs. First of all, we believe that our bodies aren't ours, as we've just explained, and therefore it's not up to us to decide what we're going to do with them when we die. We bury a corpse as per the instruction of the owner in his manual called the Torah. And we're really, really strong on affirming this belief. And then, of course, as you probably know, one of the fundamental tenets of Judaism, included by Maimonides as one of Judaism's 13 principles of faith, is the belief in the resurrection of the dead, which happens at some time in the future, and the belief in the coming of the Mashiach and the resurrection of the dead is part of our 2,000-year tradition, and one who believes in the resurrection and the holiness of the body is not going to destroy it. So burying a body intact is affirmation of this belief. Just a couple of slides to take us through this section over here. There is a question that's often asked today, and one with which I've had to deal on quite a number of occasions. What happens if a person has requested that they wish to be cremated? Are you obligated to follow their wishes, or are you permitted to ignore their wishes and to bury them instead? Sometimes it's a request which is made in ignorance. Sometimes it's made in spite. Sometimes it's it's a very firm belief, but this is the better way to go. What does a family do under those circumstances? How do you deal with this? And as a matter of fact, you see, as you'll see in text 15a on page 64, it is a mitzvah to implement the expressed or final wishes of a person who's deceased. So that puts the cat among the pigeons, because a person's last testament is very, very serious, and you're obligated to fulfill what they have asked for. And therefore families very often feel very reluctant to contravene the express will of somebody who they've loved. But you see, there's actually an exception to this rule, and this is the one exception, as you'll see in text 15b on page 64. Again, very short. It's taken from Maimonides again. if a person requested not to be buried, we disregard the request. And this is because burial is a mitzvah, as it is stated in Deuteronomy that we already read, you shall surely bury him. Does that sound odd to you? Is that difficult?
No, but you'd think it would be discussed beforehand if there's a chance to.
What do you mean not to be buried? Do you mean not to be buried anywhere and just to stay, the body to stay?
No, to be cremated or whatever.
Oh, right, another kind of burial.
Yeah. Anything other than burial. Yeah.
I think I can just come in. I remember my late father, O'Shola, whose birthday actually was 2 days ago. He said, "Oh, I can be cremated." He was traditional, but for himself, he didn't he wasn't egotistic, and I think that was what was behind it.
Yeah.
We didn't listen to him.
So yeah, sometimes they're
We were going to tell him. We told him we weren't going to listen to him, so he knew.
Sometimes they're very noble. Look, my father-in-law wanted to be cremated. It was difficult, and persuaded him not to, etc., and explained the importance of wanting to be able to visit a grave and to be there, etc., for reasons which we'll see in a moment, by the way. But sometimes you don't have a chance to discuss it in advance, and you're left only with this difficult situation. But there is a sense over here that perhaps after the person has passed away, what does their soul want now, as opposed to what they wanted when they were alive? And that's the tricky question.
What about being buried at sea?
Well, yes, indeed. What would you do under those circumstances?
I lost a friend recently. She wasn't Jewish, but nonetheless, she had a cardiac arrest, and it was very sudden. And before they even turned off the machine, they were asking her daughter whether she could donate her kidney.
Yeah.
And there wasn't time for my friend Sue to discuss this because it was she suddenly had a cardiac arrest.
Yeah. Well, the law has changed, by the way, and now you have to opt out rather than opt in. So now it's taken for granted that your organs can be donated to help another person live, and that is actually halachically permitted unless you want to opt out. So I just we just need to move on a bit because time has moved on. I just want to take you through these next couple of slides over here. This is the prohibition against cremation, because it's associated with some of burials associated with some of Judaism's core beliefs. And there's your indelible marker. It constitutes an irrevocable statement. And moving on over here, it's a mitzvah to implement expressed wishes of the deceased. However, lovely slide, isn't it? The telephone hanging on the hook, off the hook. If a person requested not to be buried, you disregard this request, and administering a Jewish burial is granting what the deceased really wanted.
So it's even a further violation with the Holocaust.
Yes, of course. Well, that was all cremation, but that was against their will, so there's nothing to say about it. Now I want to talk about visiting the grave. This is really important for us, because the burial of a person doesn't spell the end of our connection to their physical remains after they've died. And this, therefore, is going to take us to a very meaningful Jewish practice associated with those who have died, and that is visiting the grave site. Because visiting a grave expresses respect for the person who's died, shows that their memory has not been forgotten, and also reinforces our continuing connection with them. And this is really important. This is the real reason why we visit graves. Watch this. It's respect for the departed. It's the memory has not been forgotten. I don't know why they've put up an umbrella over here, but that reinforces our continuous connection. Let me show you how. I'll come back to the next slide in a moment. Remember, we learned earlier that according to the Kabbalah, that even as the soul ascends on high, remember that the Nephesh, the Ruach, goes up. Remember what happened to the Nephesh? It remains with the body. in the grave, even after 12 months. It's always there. It never goes away. There's always a spiritual part of that person, even after the body has decomposed, that is still there at the grave. And that's the point that is being made by the Zohar, the Kabbalah, in text number 16 on page 66. Why doesn't somebody read it, please?
The Nephesh remains present in the grave. Due to the fact that it remains among the living, it is acquainted with their pain. At their time of need, it pleads with God for mercy on their behalf. When the inhabitants of the world are in need, when they are in sorrow and visit the cemetery, the Nephesh is aroused to their plight. It ascends and awakens the Ruach, which in turn entreats God for mercy. Consequently, the Holy One, blessed be He, has mercy on the world.
So now you've got it. The grave is a portal. It's a portal to the soul of that person. It's the way in which you reach them. It's a place. Of course, their ruach is everywhere. You can reach them. They walk. They carry. You have your parents walking around inside of you all the time. That's their ruach. But if you're looking for something tangible, you go to the graveside because the nephesh is there. And this is effectively what happens. So the nephesh is present among the living, and therefore it feels their pain. So when people visit the grave, the nephesh is aroused. And the nephesh awakens the ruach. And the ruach entreats God. That's what we mean, that the grave is a portal or a communication point. And that is why we visit graves.
Can I just ask you something, Rabbi Shlomo? Because when I go to St. Waltham Abbey to visit relatives, and there's a little prayer pamphlet there, I'm sure it always says something to the words like, it's more for yourself that you go than for the deceased. You know that it's visiting the grave is more.
Yes, the point we make. Well, of course, it's for both, but the point we're making over here is that we go to graves, of course, out of respect for the person, all the things we said before. But if we're talking about us, it's a place where our own prayers can be answered. We're asking our loved ones or the righteous person, that tzaddik, whoever it is, to entreat the Almighty on our behalf. We arouse this part which is up over there. From down over here, we kind of like tickle it and arouse it, wake it up, and that's there to help us in our times of pain, and our times of difficulty, and our times of despair, and our times when we need to connect, when we need to remember, etc. We need to feel them. That's all for our benefit as well. Yes. Text number 17 on page 67 as we come to the end. Could somebody read this, please?
There was once a community that wished to relocate. One of the deceased, buried in the vicinity, appeared in a dream to a member of the community and pleaded, "Please do not abandon us, for we appreciate your visits to our cemetery." Barzillai the Gileadite declared, "I would like to die in my own city." He wished for this because the deceased appreciate when their loved ones visit their graves and request goodness for their souls. This improves their condition in heaven, and when we pray on behalf of the deceased, they pray for us in turn.
And so you see, actually, that's a reciprocal arrangement, isn't it? They help us and we help them. They want us to visit. There's nothing sadder than seeing graves that have been abandoned by children who never visit, uncared for. There are, of course, special times when we visit graves, and the dead appreciate visitors. The connection is mutual, and there are special days to visit graves, such as the days of a Yortzeit, the days before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, as you know. These are auspicious times to visit graves. So in conclusion, because we've had a long session tonight, much of today's lesson has been devoted to the soul's disengagement from the body, the Ruach from the Nephesh, which allows us to have a deeper and a more essential relationship with the soul. And then we explained how the soul's disengagement from the body and the Ruach from the Nephesh allows us to have a deeper and a more essential relationship with our loved ones. Then we explained how here in this world, accompanying the soul in its painful journey, we explained the gradual divestment of the soul from the body and the way in which we mourn the body and comfort it. We explained the special relationship that we have with the deceased, which includes the body too, therefore the tremendous respect. And finally, we explained how our relationship with the deceased leads us to visit its earthly resting place from time to time. We're going to conclude with an excerpt from a letter that the Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote in 1958 to Mrs. Hannah Scharfstein, a young woman who within a 5-year period lost her father, her mother, and her mother-in-law. And she wrote a very emotional letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe describing how she was so terribly, terribly alone. And this beautiful letter was his response. It's text number 18 on page 68, and it needs someone to read it, please. Someone who hasn't read yet? Go for it.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Blessing and greeting. I received your undated letters in which you write about your emotional upsets in connection with the passing of your mother and the questions which are troubling you in this connection, involving also questions in regard to the passing of your father. Peace unto them. Another fundamental point to remember, which has a direct bearing on your letter, is that all believers in God believe also in the survival of the soul. Actually, this principle has even been discovered in this principle world, where science now holds as an absolute truth that nothing in the physical world can be absolutely destroyed. How much more so in the spiritual world, especially in the case of the soul, which in no way can be affected by the death and disintegration of the physical body. It would be silly and illogical to assume that because a certain organ of the body ceases to function, affecting other physical organs of the body, the spiritual soul would also be affected thereby. The truth is that when the physical body ceases to function, the soul continues its existence, not only as before, but even on a higher level, inasmuch as it is no longer handicapped by the restraints of the physical frame. Thirdly, the attachment of children to their parents and the general attachment between close relatives during life on this earth is surely not a physical attachment by the respective physical bodies of the relatives. Essentially, the attachment is a spiritual one due to the spiritual affinity between those concerned and the qualities of the soul, including such spiritual things as character, kindness, goodness, etc., all of which are attributes of the soul and not of the body. Therefore, also, every action on the part of a person in relation to a beloved person and the desire to benefit that person is not directed towards pleasing his physical body, his bones and tissue, for it is the spiritual pleasure that one is concerned with. In view of the above, it is clear that even after the physical body has disintegrated and disappeared from view, it is still possible to bring joy and benefit to the soul, which, as noted above, not only survives but does so on a higher level, and all the things which had previously brought joy and pleasure to one's parents will continue to do so even after they are physically no longer here.
Thank you very much, Sue. And we're going to end tonight with just a little video that will once again encapsulate everything we've learned.
Lesson 2. Taking leave. 1. Nephesh and Ruach are two of the soul's components. After death, the Nephesh remains with the body, while the Ruach disengages and ascends to Gan Eden, paradise. 2. Once the Ruach is no longer limited to material existence, it's more accessible to all who wish to connect to it. Thus, when a person dies, our ability to spiritually connect with him or her is stronger and deeper than before. 3. Though the Nephesh remains in the grave, it retains a connection with the higher levels of the soul. The gravesite is thus a portal where we can communicate with departed souls and ask them to intercede before God on our behalf. 4. Over the course of a lifetime, the soul and body integrate and bond. Their separation at death is therefore painful for the soul. 5. The soul departs the body in stages. These stages correspond to the prescribed periods of mourning. When we mourn, we are mourning not only for the deceased, but also with the deceased. 6. Dignity and sensitivity are the underlying principles that guide the care of a corpse and its preparation for burial. This is because even after death, the body retains its special status of having been the container for the soul. 7. Burial is of highest priority in Jewish tradition and culture. When God takes a person's soul, we are tasked to return the body to the place from which God fashioned it. 8. Burial affirms two fundamental Jewish beliefs. A. Our bodies aren't ours. They belong to God. And B. There will be a resurrection of the dead in the Messianic era.
So there you have it, a long session. I hope that it was informative. Some difficult parts, I understand, but I hope that we feel that we have a stronger connection with the people who've passed away. We know more about what happened when they died, more about what we can do now to feel their presence and to connect with them. The significance, of course, of each of the stages of the Yortzeit. And all of this was from the perspective mainly of the soul. Next week, we're going to talk about us and what happens to us when a person passes away. We'll be talking about the kinds of things that many of us have already experienced and how we deal with bereavement and with everything that it entails. Life is not always easy, and neither is death, and that is what we are exploring in this series.